The cook just wanted to ease the pain with a song. But when she sang in Chinese in the kitchen, the millionaire panicked. The next day, she was fired without explanation. But what that song revealed would change everything forever. The kitchen at the Coleman mansion hummed with the quiet efficiency that Emily Carter had perfected over 5 long years. Steam rose from the industrial-grade stovetop as she stirred a delicate béarnaise sauce, her movements precise and practiced. The marble countertops gleamed under the warm pendant lights, reflecting the careful order she maintained in what had become her sanctuary within these opulent walls. At 28, Emily had learned to make herself invisible. It was a skill she'd developed long before she ever set foot in this Chicago mansion, back when kids at Jefferson Elementary would pull at the corners of their eyes and speak in mock Chinese gibberish whenever she walked by. Back then, she'd go home crying to her mother, Lily, who would hold her tight and whisper in Mandarin, "Our culture is a gift, not a shame, my little flower." But that was before everything changed, before the accident that wasn't really an accident, though Emily wouldn't learn that truth for years to come. She glanced at the clock mounted above the Sub-Zero refrigerator, 6:30 p.m. The Colemans would be expecting dinner service to begin soon, and tonight wasn't just any night. Richard Coleman, the master of this house and her employer for half a decade, had been pacing the marble floors of his study all afternoon. Emily had heard fragments of heated phone conversations drifting through the walls, something about investors, contracts, and numbers that made her boss's voice crack with desperation. The whole damn empire's riding on tonight, she'd heard him tell someone over the phone earlier. If Huang doesn't sign, we're finished. Emily dried her hands on her apron, a simple white one that matched the uniform she wore every day. Plain black slacks, white button-down shirt, comfortable shoes that didn't make noise on the imported Italian marble. She'd learned early on that the Colemans preferred their help to be seen but not heard, present but not memorable. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, fluent in 3 dialects of Chinese, holder of a degree in international relations that she'd never been able to use, working as a cook in a house where her employers didn't even know her middle name. They certainly didn't know that she understood every word when Richard would take calls with his overseas contacts, speaking in what he thought was private English about deals that sounded increasingly desperate. A door slammed somewhere in the house, followed by the sharp click of heels on marble. Angela Coleman was home from her shopping expedition, no doubt laden with bags from Michigan Avenue's most exclusive boutiques. Emily could always tell Angela's mood by the sound of her footsteps. Today they carried the particular staccato rhythm of frustration. "Richard," Angela's voice echoed through the house, shrill with barely contained anxiety. "We need to talk about tonight. I've been thinking about the seating arrangements." And, "Not now, Angela." Richard's response was muffled but audible through the mansion's acoustic quirks. "I've got 3 hours to figure out how to save our asses, and you're worried about place cards." Emily continued her preparations, but her ears were tuned to the familiar symphony of the Coleman marriage, a discordant blend of public pretense and private desperation. Over the years, she'd become an unwilling audience to their fights about money, status, and Richard's wandering eye. Angela suspected her husband of having affairs, though Emily had never seen evidence of any. The truth was, Richard Coleman was too consumed with his crumbling business empire to have energy for romance. The kitchen door swung open, and Miguel, one of the evening servers, poked his head in. "Emily, they want the appetizers ready by 7:30, full spread for 12 guests." 12. Emily looked up from the sauce she was whisking. "I thought it was just the Chinese investor and maybe his assistant." Miguel shrugged. "Mrs. Coleman invited some of her society friends, said she wanted to create the right atmosphere for international relations." He made air quotes with his fingers and rolled his eyes. Emily sighed. Angela's idea of international relations usually involved showcasing the family's wealth and connections, which meant tonight would be even more challenging. She'd prepared an elegant menu that walked the line between sophisticated Western cuisine and subtle Asian influences, something she'd hoped might appeal to their important guest, without being too obvious about it. She'd learned about Brian Huang through fragments of conversation over the past week. He was some kind of major investor from Beijing, apparently Richard's last hope for the $50 million deal that would keep Coleman Industries afloat. Richard had mentioned hiring an interpreter for the evening, someone who could help navigate any language barriers during the crucial negotiation. As Emily plated the first course, seared scallops with a ginger soy reduction that she'd tweaked to bridge east and west, she found herself thinking about her parents. James and Lily Chen had come to America in the early 80s, with dreams of building something lasting. They'd worked 16-hour days at a restaurant in Chinatown. Saving every penny they could when Emily was born, they'd chosen to give her an American name, hoping it would open doors that had remained closed to them. Emily Carter, her mother had explained when she was old enough to understand. Carter was the name of the family who sponsored us when we first arrived. We wanted you to have every advantage, to belong here in a way we never could. But belonging had been harder than any of them had anticipated. The kids at school saw her face and heard her name and couldn't reconcile the two. She was too Asian to be fully American, too American to find comfort in the Chinese community her parents had left behind. So she'd learned to exist in the spaces between, invisible and useful, present but forgettable. The accident had happened during her senior year of college, a late-night drive home from the restaurant where her parents still worked. Even after all their success in America, the police said James had fallen asleep at the wheel, but Emily had never quite believed it. Her father was the most careful driver she'd ever known, paranoid about safety after years of navigating Chicago's dangerous streets. But 18-year-old Emily had been drowning in grief and student loans, with no energy left to question the official story. She'd taken the first job she could find, a position as a cook for a wealthy family who needed someone reliable and unobtrusive. The Colemans had been that family, and somehow, 5 years had slipped by without her ever finding a reason to leave. The kitchen timer chimed, pulling Emily back to the present. She could hear voices in the front hall now. Guests were beginning to arrive. Through the service window, she caught glimpses of expensive suits and glittering jewelry as Chicago's elite gathered for what they assumed would be just another dinner party. If only they knew how much was really riding on tonight. Emily had overheard enough of Richard's conversations to understand that Coleman Industries was hemorrhaging money, that this deal with Brian Huang wasn't just about expansion. It was about survival. Without it, the mansion, the lifestyle, the carefully constructed facade of success would all come crashing down. She arranged the appetizers on silver platters, her hands steady despite the tension she could feel building throughout the house. Somewhere beyond these kitchen walls, her employer was about to face the most important night of his life, and Emily, as always, would remain in the background. Invisible and essential, keeping the machinery of their privileged world running smoothly. What she didn't know was that tonight, for the first time in 5 years, she wouldn't be able to stay invisible. Tonight, her carefully buried heritage would surface in ways that would change everything. Not just for her, but for everyone in this house. The first guests were settling into the dining room now, their voices a mixture of English and anticipation. Emily smoothed her apron one final time and prepared to serve, unaware that this would be the last night she would ever fade into the background of the Coleman mansion. The Coleman mansion had been transformed into a showcase of understated elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the dining room, where 12-place settings of fine bone china awaited the evening's guests. Emily moved through the space like a ghost, adjusting silverware and ensuring water glasses were filled to perfection. While the murmur of conversation grew louder in the adjacent parlor, Richard Coleman stood near the fireplace, his usually confident demeanor betrayed by the slight tremor in his hands as he nursed a scotch. He'd changed into his most expensive suit, a Tom Ford creation that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, but even the finest tailoring couldn't hide the desperation that seemed to radiate from his every pore. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced as the grandfather clock chimed 8 o'clock, "I believe our guest of honor has arrived." Through the tall windows facing the circular driveway, Emily could see a black sedan pulling up to the entrance. Her heart rate quickened for reasons she couldn't quite explain. She'd been anticipating this moment all evening, though she told herself it was simply professional curiosity about the man who might determine her employer's fate. Brian Huang stepped out of the car with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He appeared to be in his early 50s. Impeccably dressed in a navy suit that spoke of European craftsmanship, his movements were deliberate and graceful as he approached the front door, followed by what Emily assumed was his assistant. A younger man carrying a leather briefcase, Richard hurried to greet his guests personally, something Emily had rarely seen him do. Usually, the house staff handled arrivals while Richard made his grand entrance fashionably late. Tonight was different. Tonight, Everything was riding on making the right impression. "Mr. Huang." Richard's voice carried clearly through the foyer as Emily positioned herself near the kitchen doorway. "Ready to begin service. Welcome to our home. It's an honor to finally meet you in person." Brian Huang's response was polite but measured, his English carrying only the slightest trace of an accent. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Coleman. I look forward to our discussion this evening." The formal introductions continued as Richard presented Brian to the other guests, a carefully curated selection of Chicago's business elite. Chosen to demonstrate Coleman Industries' connections and credibility, Angela played her part perfectly, the gracious hostess in a designer gown that probably cost more than Emily's annual salary. As the group moved toward the dining room, Emily noticed something that sent a chill through her stomach. Richard kept glancing toward the foyer, his expression growing increasingly tense. She caught fragments of whispered conversation between him and his assistant. "Where the hell is Morrison?" Richard hissed. "His office said he left an hour ago, sir. Maybe traffic. Call him again now." Emily felt a sinking sensation as she realized what was happening. Morrison must be the interpreter Richard had hired for the evening. And apparently, Morrison wasn't here. The dinner service began flawlessly, with Emily and the other staff moving in choreographed precision. The seared scallops were met with appreciative murmurs, and the wine, a carefully selected vintage that Richard had probably spent hours researching, flowed freely. But Emily could see the tension building in her employer's shoulders with each passing minute. By the time the main course was served, herb-crusted lamb with seasonal vegetables, Richard's facade was beginning to crack. He'd excused himself twice to make phone calls, returning each time with a deeper furrow in his brow. Brian Huang, meanwhile, remained politely engaged with the other guests. Though Emily noticed he seemed to be observing everything with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to reading situations quickly. The breaking point came during dessert. Richard's phone buzzed for what must have been the 20th time that evening, and when he glanced at the screen, his face went pale. "If you'll excuse me for just one moment," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Business never sleeps, as they say." Emily was clearing plates in the kitchen when she heard Richard's voice explode from his study. "What do you mean?" "Car accident. How the hell does my interpreter get into a car accident on the most important night of my goddamn life?" The phone slammed down, followed by what sounded like glass breaking. Emily exchanged glances with Miguel, who was loading the dishwasher. They'd both worked for the Colemans long enough to recognize the signs of a complete meltdown. When Richard returned to the dining room 5 minutes later, his composure was hanging by a thread. Emily watched from the service doorway as he attempted to engage Brian Huang in what was clearly meant to be the evening's crucial business discussion. "Mr. Huang, I'm hoping we can talk specifics about the partnership opportunity we discussed," Richard began. But his voice lacked its usual commanding tone. Brian Huang nodded politely and began speaking in what Emily immediately recognized as Mandarin, his voice carrying the formal cadences of business discussion. The other guests fell silent, clearly expecting Richard to respond or for a translator to step forward. Instead, there was only awkward silence. Richard's face flushed red as the seconds ticked by. Brian continued speaking, perhaps testing whether Richard actually understood, but it became increasingly clear that her employer was completely lost. The other guests began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and Angela's smile became strained and artificial. "I'm afraid there seems to be a miscommunication," Richard finally managed, his voice tight with embarrassment. "Our interpreter was delayed." Emily felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. Brian Huang's Mandarin wasn't just business speak. He was reciting what sounded like a traditional greeting, formal but warm, the kind of respectful acknowledgement her own parents had taught her to offer to honored guests. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Emily found herself stepping forward from her position by the service door. The dining room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. The invisible servant girl who was suddenly, inexplicably, walking toward the head of the table. "Mr. Huang," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "您好，欢迎来到科尔曼家。我们很荣幸能够接待您这样尊贵的客人." The effect was electric. Brian Huang's eyes widened with surprise and delight, while Richard's mouth fell open in shock. The other guests murmured among themselves, clearly amazed that the help could speak Chinese. But Emily wasn't finished. Something deeper was stirring now. a memory of her mother's voice teaching her about respect and hospitality, about honoring guests and building bridges between cultures. Almost without conscious decision, she began to sing, softly at first, then with growing confidence. The song was ancient, a traditional welcome melody that her mother had learned from her own grandmother back in Guangzhou. It spoke of open doors and shared rice, of friendships that transcended borders, of the universal language of hospitality. Emily's voice carried the melody with crystalline clarity, each note weighted with genuine emotion and cultural pride that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. When the last note faded, the dining room was completely silent. Brian Huang sat transfixed, his eyes bright with what looked suspiciously like tears. Slowly, he began to applaud, and the sound broke the spell that had fallen over the room. "Extraordinary," he said in perfect English, his voice thick with emotion. "I have not heard that song since my grandmother sang it to me as a child." "Young lady, that was magnificent." Richard was staring at Emily as if seeing her for the first time in 5 years, which, in many ways, he was. "Emily, I had no idea you spoke fluently," Brian interrupted, switching back to Mandarin as he addressed Emily directly. "Tell me, where did you learn to sing like that?" Emily felt the weight of every eye in the room, but for the first time in years, she didn't want to disappear. "My mother taught me," she replied in Mandarin. "She said that music was the bridge between hearts when words alone weren't enough." What followed was the most extraordinary business dinner Emily had ever witnessed, with her serving as interpreter. Richard and Brian Huang dove into detailed negotiations that quickly revealed the depth of both men's business acumen. Emily found herself not just translating words, but explaining cultural contexts, helping each man understand not just what the other was saying, but what they truly meant. By the time coffee was served, Brian Huang had agreed to the $50 million partnership that would save Coleman Industries. More than that, he'd insisted on expanding the deal to include cultural exchange programs and educational initiatives that spoke to his deeper values. "Mr. Coleman," Brian said as the evening wound down, "you have remarkable people working for you. This young woman has impressed me more than any professional interpreter I've ever worked with." Richard's response was enthusiastic, but Emily caught the calculating look in his eyes as he watched her interact with his most important client. She'd just saved his empire, and they both knew it. What Emily didn't notice was Angela Coleman standing in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury as she watched her husband's obvious fascination with the help who had just become the evening's unlikely hero. The morning after the dinner party dawned gray and cold, with Lake Michigan's wind rattling the windows of the Coleman mansion like an unwelcome visitor. Emily had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening on an endless loop. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see the faces around that dining table. The surprise, the admiration, the sudden recognition of her existence after 5 years of being invisible. She'd arrived for work an hour early, as was her habit, and threw herself into preparing breakfast with more intensity than usual. The familiar routine of chopping fresh fruit and brewing Richard's preferred dark roast coffee usually calmed her nerves, but today her hands trembled slightly as she worked. Everything felt different now. The kitchen that had been her sanctuary suddenly felt exposed, like a stage where she was still performing last night's unexpected role. Richard had left for the airport at 6 a.m., heading to New York to finalize some contracts related to the Huang deal. Before departing, he'd stopped by the kitchen, something he'd never done in 5 years of employment. "Emily," he'd said, his voice carrying a warmth she'd never heard before. "What you did last night, I can't thank you enough. When I get back, we need to talk about your future here. There might be opportunities we haven't explored." The way he'd looked at her had made Emily uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite define. It wasn't inappropriate, exactly, but there was an intensity there that felt dangerous, like she'd suddenly become visible in ways that went beyond professional appreciation. Now, with Richard gone and the house settling into its usual morning quiet, Emily tried to focus on her work. She was arranging fresh flowers in the breakfast nook when she heard the sharp click of heels on marble that announced Angela's approach. Mrs. Coleman entered the kitchen like a storm front, her silk robe billowing behind her, and her perfectly styled hair suggesting she'd been awake for hours. Despite the early hour, Emily had seen Angela angry before, usually at Richard, occasionally at incompetent service staff, but the expression on her employer's face this morning was something else entirely. It was cold, calculated fury wrapped in the veneer of upper-class civility. "Emily," Angela said, her voice honey-sweet in a way that immediately put Emily on guard. "I was hoping we could have a little chat." Emily set down the vase she'd been arranging and turned to face her employer, her heart already beginning to race. "Of course, Mrs. Coleman. What can I do for you?" Angela moved closer, her movements predatory and deliberate. She was a beautiful woman in her early 40s, the kind of polished perfection that came from unlimited resources and careful maintenance. But this morning, there was something sharp and dangerous in her blue eyes that reminded Emily of broken glass. "Last night was quite the performance," Angela began, perching on one of the breakfast bar stools with feline grace. "I had no idea we'd been harboring such hidden talents in our kitchen." The way she said hidden talents made Emily's skin crawl. There was accusation buried in those words. Suggestion of deception and manipulation that Emily knew wasn't fair, but couldn't figure out how to defend against. "I was just trying to help," Emily said quietly. Mr. Coleman seemed distressed about the interpreter not showing up. "Oh, I'm sure you were just trying to help," Angela replied, her smile sharp enough to cut. "It's interesting, though, don't you think? 5 years you've worked in this house, and somehow it never came up that you speak fluent Chinese, that you have skills that might be valuable to my husband's business." Emily felt heat rising in her cheeks. "You never asked. It wasn't relevant to my job duties, wasn't it?" Angela stood and began pacing around the kitchen island, her movements making Emily feel like prey being circled by a predator. "Because it seems to me that someone with your linguistic abilities might have been listening to quite a few conversations over the years, understanding things that weren't meant for your ears." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Emily realized with growing horror where this conversation was heading, but she felt powerless to stop it. "Mrs. Coleman, I would never—" "Wouldn't you?" Angela's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of a shout. "See, here's what I think happened. I think you've been playing a very long game. Collecting information, waiting for the right moment to leverage your position." Emily's mouth went dry. "That's not true. I've never—" "Then explain this." Angela pulled out her phone and showed Emily a photograph that made her blood turn to ice. It was a picture of Emily's small apartment, taken from outside her building. "Explain how someone who makes $30,000 a year can afford to live in a neighborhood like Lincoln Park." Emily stared at the phone screen, her mind reeling. Her apartment was modest by any standard, a tiny one-bedroom in an older building that she could barely afford even with her savings from living frugally for 5 years. But she realized with sinking horror that to someone like Angela, even her small place might seem suspiciously expensive for a domestic worker. "I live very simply," Emily managed. "I save most of my salary. Do you?" Angela's voice was getting shriller now, the cultured facade beginning to crack. "Or have you been supplementing your income, selling information about my husband's business dealings? Is that how you knew exactly what to say to Mr. Huang last night?" Emily felt like the world was tilting beneath her feet. "Mrs. Coleman, I swear to you, I have never sold any information or betrayed your family's trust. Everything I did last night was to help." "Help yourself, you mean?" Angela slammed her phone down on the marble counter, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. "God, I am so stupid. 5 years of letting a spy live in our house, eat our food, learn our secrets. Richard might be fooled by your innocent act, but I see right through you. It's not an act," Emily said desperately. "Mrs. Coleman, please. You have to believe me. I would never—" "Shut up!" Angela's voice cracked like a whip. "Just shut up with your lies. I know what you are. I know what you've been doing. And I know exactly what you're planning to do next." Emily opened her mouth to protest again, but Angela held up a perfectly manicured hand. "Here's what's going to happen," Angela said, her voice returning to that terrifyingly calm tone. "You're going to pack up your things and get out of my house today. Right now. And if you ever try to contact my husband, if you ever try to use whatever information you think you have about our family, I will destroy you." "Mrs. Coleman," I said, "shut up," Angela screamed, all pretense of civility finally abandoning her. "You think I don't know what you're really after. You think I'm blind. I saw the way Richard looked at you last night. I saw how impressed he was with his little Chinese pet who could sing and dance for his business partners." The racial slur hit Emily like a physical blow. But Angela wasn't finished. "Let me make something very clear to you," Angela continued, leaning across the counter until her face was inches from Emily's. "I built this life, this house, this status, this family. It's mine, and I will not let some scheming little immigrant bitch destroy what I've worked for." Emily felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of this woman who had just stripped away 5 years of careful dignity with a few cruel words. "I need this job," Emily said quietly. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." Angela's smile was triumphant and cold. "Should have thought of that before you decided to play games with people who are smarter than you. You have 1 hour to get your things and leave. And Emily," she leaned in closer, "if you breathe a word about last night to anyone, if you try to claim credit for saving Richard's deal, or use it to get work somewhere else, I will make sure every wealthy family in Chicago knows exactly what kind of person you really are. A thief, a liar, a manipulator who can't be trusted." Angela straightened and smoothed her robe, her composure returning as quickly as it had departed. "Maria will escort you out when you're ready. Don't take anything that doesn't belong to you." With that, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Emily standing alone among the gleaming appliances and carefully arranged flowers that had been her world for 5 years. Emily sank onto one of the bar stools, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The injustice of it crashed over her in waves, being accused of crimes she'd never committed, punished for helping when she should have stayed invisible, destroyed for finally allowing herself to be proud of who she was. But beneath the hurt and fear, something else was stirring. For the first time in years, Emily found herself thinking about her parents, not just their deaths, but their lives. Their courage in coming to a country that didn't always welcome them, their determination to build something better for their daughter. "Our culture is a gift, not a shame," her mother had said last night. For just a few moments, Emily had remembered what that felt like, now as she climbed the service stairs to her small room to pack her few belongings. Emily made a decision. She was done being invisible. She was done being ashamed, and she was definitely done letting people like Angela Coleman define who she was or what she was worth. She had no idea where she would go or what she would do, but for the first time in 10 years, Emily Carter was about to stop running from who she really was. The rain had started during Emily's cab ride from the Coleman mansion, turning Chicago's streets into rivers of reflected neon and blurred headlights. She pressed her face against the window, watching the familiar skyline blur past as the taxi carried her toward Chinatown, a neighborhood she'd avoided for years, but somehow knew was the only place she could go. Her single suitcase sat beside her on the cracked vinyl seat, containing everything she owned that mattered: a few changes of clothes, her parents' wedding photo, and the small jade bracelet her mother had given her on her 16th birthday. Everything else, 5 years of careful savings, the life she'd built in Lincoln Park, the security she'd fought so hard to maintain, had crumbled in the span of a single morning. The address she'd given the driver was burned into her memory from childhood: 2247 South Wentworth Avenue. Aunt Remedios had lived in the same narrow townhouse for 30 years, though Emily hadn't visited since her parents' funeral. The guilt of that absence weighed heavily on her now, along with everything else. "This is it, lady," the driver announced, pulling up in front of a modest brick building squeezed between a dim sum restaurant and a shop selling traditional Chinese medicine. Emily paid the fare with bills from her rapidly diminishing emergency fund and stepped out into the cold rain. The neighborhood felt like stepping back in time. Red lanterns swayed in the wind above sidewalks crowded with vendors selling everything from fresh fish to bootleg DVDs. The air smelled of garlic and soy sauce, and something indefinably familiar that made Emily's chest tighten with memories she'd spent years trying to suppress. She climbed the narrow steps to her aunt's front door, her suitcase bumping against each concrete step. Before she could lose her nerve, she pressed the doorbell and waited, listening to the sound of footsteps approaching from inside. The woman who opened the door looked exactly as Emily remembered, only smaller somehow. Remedios Chen was 73 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun and hands weathered by decades of hard work. She wore a faded floral house dress and thick wool slippers, and when she saw Emily standing on her doorstep, her face went through a rapid succession of emotions: surprise, recognition, concern, and finally, unmistakable love. "Ah, yeah, Emily," she said softly, switching immediately to Mandarin. Little flower, what has happened to you? The endearment broke something loose inside Emily's chest. She'd forgotten that her aunt had always called her the same thing her mother had, little flower, and hearing it now felt like coming home and falling apart at the same time. Aunt Remedios, Emily managed before her voice cracked completely. I'm sorry to just show up like this. I didn't know where else to go. Her aunt took one look at Emily's tear-streaked face and rain-soaked clothes and immediately pulled her inside, fussing over her in the way that only Chinese aunties could manage. Within minutes, Emily found herself seated at a small kitchen table with a cup of hot jasmine tea warming her hands, while Remedios bustled around preparing food and asking pointed questions about what had brought her niece to her doorstep. The kitchen was tiny but immaculately organized, filled with the smell of star anise and dried mushrooms. Red paper cutouts of the character for happiness adorned the windows, and a small shrine to Emily's parents occupied one corner, complete with fresh oranges and burning incense. As Emily haltingly explained what had happened at the Coleman mansion, she watched her aunt's expression grow progressively darker. When she finished, Remedios set down her teacup with enough force to make the saucers rattle. That woman is a fool, Remedios said bluntly, and her husband is worse than a fool if he believes her lies. But Emily, child, this might be the best thing that could have happened to you? Emily looked up in surprise. How can you say that? I lost everything today. My job, my apartment, my savings. You lost their version of who you should be, Remedios interrupted gently. Maybe now you can remember who you actually are. The words stung because they carried too much truth. Emily realized she'd been performing a careful balancing act for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without constantly monitoring herself for signs of too much Chineseness, too much otherness, too much anything that might make her unwelcome in the white spaces she'd learned to navigate. I don't know who I am anymore, Emily admitted quietly. I don't know how to be Chinese enough for places like this, but I'm apparently too Chinese for places like the Coleman's world. Remedios reached across the table and took Emily's hands in her own. Her aunt's palms were rough from years of factory work, but her touch was infinitely gentle. You are your parents' daughter, she said simply. That is enough. That has always been enough. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the rain against the windows and the distant sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening. Finally, Remedios spoke again, her voice carrying a weight that made Emily look up sharply. There are things you need to know, her aunt said. Things about your parents that I should have told you years ago, but you were so young when they died, and you were hurting so much, I thought maybe it would be better if you didn't know. But now, Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach. What kind of things? Remedios stood and walked to a small cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. She retrieved a manila envelope that looked like it had been handled many times, its edges soft with wear. She set it on the table between them but didn't open it immediately. Your parents didn't die in an accident, Emily, Remedios said quietly. They were murdered. The words hit Emily like a physical blow. She'd suspected something wasn't right about that night. The circumstances had never quite made sense, but hearing it stated so bluntly made her feel like the world was tilting beneath her feet. What do you mean, murdered? She whispered. Remedios opened the envelope and pulled out a collection of newspaper clippings, police reports, and handwritten notes. Emily recognized her father's careful script on some of the papers. In the months before they died, your parents had been investigating some irregularities at the restaurant where they worked, Remedios began. They discovered that the owner was using the business to launder money for some very dangerous people, American businessmen working with Asian crime syndicates. Emily's hands shook as she picked up one of the newspaper clippings. The headline read, "Local couple dies in late-night accident," but there were handwritten notes in the margins, question marks and exclamation points that suggested someone had been analyzing every detail. Your father was keeping records, Remedios continued. Names, dates, financial transactions. He was planning to go to the FBI, but someone found out. How do you know all this? Emily asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Because he told me, the week before they died. Your father came here with all these papers. He said if anything happened to him and your mother, I should make sure you knew the truth when you were old enough to handle it. Emily stared at the papers spread across the table, her mind reeling. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because you were 18 and alone and grieving, Remedios said gently. Because you had enough to worry about just surviving, and because, she hesitated, because some of the men involved were very powerful. I was afraid that if you knew, you might try to do something about it. I was afraid I would lose you too. Emily picked up another document, a photocopy of financial records with several names highlighted in yellow. One name made her blood freeze. Coleman Industries. Oh my God, she breathed, the pieces suddenly clicking into place with horrible clarity. Richard Coleman, Remedios said grimly. Your father's notes mention him several times. He was one of the American businessmen involved in the money laundering operation. Emily felt the room spinning around her. 5 years. She'd spent 5 years working in the house of the man who had ordered her parents killed. She'd cooked his meals, cleaned his home, saved his business deal, all while he went about his life knowing what he'd done to her family. He killed them, she said, her voice barely audible. Richard Coleman killed my parents. Your father believed so, yes. And now, Remedios gestured toward the papers. Now you need to decide what you're going to do with this information. Emily stared at the evidence scattered across her aunt's kitchen table, a roadmap to a truth she'd spent 10 years not knowing she was searching for. Her parents hadn't died because her father fell asleep at the wheel. They'd died because they'd tried to do the right thing, because they'd refused to stay silent in the face of corruption and crime. The irony was almost unbearable. She'd been fired from the Coleman mansion for supposedly being untrustworthy, when all along she'd been working for the man who had destroyed her family. But along with the horror and grief, Emily felt something else stirring, something that felt suspiciously like purpose. Her parents had died trying to expose the truth. Maybe it was time for their daughter to finish what they'd started. Aunt Remedios, Emily said slowly, her voice growing stronger with each word. I need to know everything, every detail, every name, every piece of evidence my father collected, and then I need to figure out how to make sure Richard Coleman finally pays for what he did. Her aunt smiled for the first time since Emily had arrived. And in that smile, Emily could see echoes of her mother's fierce determination and her father's quiet courage. Now you sound like your parents' daughter, Remedios said. Come, let me show you everything they left behind. 3 days had passed since Emily's world had collapsed and rebuilt itself in her aunt's small kitchen. She'd spent those days poring over her father's documents, learning about a criminal network that stretched from Chicago's Chinatown to Beijing's financial district. The evidence was damning but incomplete, enough to point toward Richard Coleman's guilt, but not enough to guarantee justice in a courtroom. Emily was sitting at Remedios's kitchen table, nursing her 3rd cup of jasmine tea and trying to make sense of a particularly cryptic financial document, when her aunt's landline phone rang. The sound was so unexpected that Emily nearly knocked over her teacup. Wei, Remedios answered in Mandarin, then switched to accented English. Yes, this is the Chen residence. Emily watched her aunt's face change as the conversation continued. Remedios's eyebrows rose higher with each response, and she kept glancing at Emily with an expression of growing amazement. Yes, she is here, Remedios said finally. May I ask who is calling? Emily felt her heart rate spike. Only a handful of people knew she was staying with her aunt, and none of them had any reason to be calling. One moment, please, Remedios said, then covered the phone with her hand. Emily, it's a man named Brian Huang. He says he met you at a dinner party and has been trying to reach you. Emily's mouth fell open. Brian Huang, the Chinese investor whose deal she'd helped save 3 nights ago. How had he even found her? With trembling hands, she took the phone from her aunt. Hello, Mr. Huang. Miss Carter. Brian's voice carried genuine warmth and relief. I have been searching for you since yesterday. When I called the Coleman house, they told me you no longer worked there, but they would not say why or how I might contact you. Emily felt a flush of embarrassment. Of course Brian would have called the mansion looking for her. He probably wanted to thank her again for her help with the translation, not knowing that her assistance had cost her everything. I'm sorry you had trouble reaching me, Emily said carefully. There were some changes in my employment situation, so I gathered. Miss Carter, I hope you will forgive my persistence, but I had your aunt's contact information from some business records, and I took the liberty of tracking you down, Because I have a proposition that I believe will interest you greatly. Emily glanced at her aunt, who was listening with unabashed curiosity. What kind of proposition? The kind that is better discussed in person. Would you be available to meet with me this afternoon? I am staying at the Peninsula Hotel downtown. The Peninsula was one of Chicago's most exclusive hotels, the kind of place where Emily had never set foot and certainly couldn't afford to visit. The thought of meeting Brian Huang in such opulent surroundings, given her current circumstances, filled her with anxiety. Mr. Huang, I appreciate your interest, but I'm not sure what kind of business we might have together. I'm just a cook. You are much more than that, Brian interrupted gently. Miss Carter, what you did the other night was extraordinary. Your linguistic skills, your cultural knowledge, your grace under pressure. These are rare gifts. I would very much like to discuss how we might put those gifts to better use. Emily felt something flutter in her chest that might have been hope. Better use. Indeed. Shall we say 3 o'clock in the Peninsula's lobby? Emily looked at her aunt, who was nodding encouragingly. Yes. I'll be there. Excellent. And Miss Carter, please dress professionally. We will be discussing your future. After Emily hung up, Remedios immediately went into action with the efficiency of a woman who'd spent decades managing crises. Within an hour, Emily found herself standing in front of her aunt's bedroom mirror, wearing a navy suit that Remedios had somehow procured from a neighbor who worked in an office downtown. You look like your mother when she had her interview at the bank, Remedios said approvingly, adjusting Emily's collar. Confident but respectful. Perfect for meeting with important business people. Emily studied her reflection. Surprised by how different she looked in professional attire, for 5 years, she'd worn nothing but service uniforms and casual clothes. The suit made her stand taller, carry herself differently. She looked like someone who belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than service kitchens. The taxi ride to downtown Chicago felt like traveling to another planet. Emily watched the familiar neighborhoods of her childhood give way to the gleaming towers of the financial district, each building representing a world she'd only glimpsed from the outside. The Peninsula Hotel was everything she'd expected. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. Brian Huang was waiting for her in the lobby, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, and reading what appeared to be a Chinese business newspaper. When he saw Emily approaching, he stood and smiled with genuine warmth. Miss Carter, thank you for coming. You look very professional today. Emily felt herself blushing. Thank you for reaching out to me, Mr. Huang. I have to admit, I'm curious about this proposition you mentioned. Excellent. Shall we adjourn to the business center? I have reserved a private conference room where we can speak freely. The conference room was smaller than Emily had expected, but elegantly appointed, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of Lake Michigan. Brian gestured for Emily to take a seat at the polished mahogany table while he opened a leather portfolio. Miss Carter, let me begin by saying that your performance the other night was the most impressive display of cultural diplomacy I have witnessed in 20 years of international business, Brian said. Not only did you save Mr. Coleman's deal, but you did so with a grace and authenticity that cannot be taught. Emily felt overwhelmed by the praise. I was just trying to help. The situation seemed desperate. Indeed it was, but your response demonstrated skills that are extraordinarily valuable in today's global marketplace. Which brings me to my proposition. Brian leaned forward, his expression growing serious. I would like to offer you a position with Huang International as our Director of Cultural Relations. Emily stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Director of... I'm sorry, what? Cultural Relations. You would be responsible for facilitating business relationships between our Chinese operations and our American partners. Translation services, cultural consulting, relationship building. Essentially, you would do what you did the other night, but on a much larger scale. Emily's mind reeled. 3 days ago, she'd been washing dishes in a mansion kitchen. Now she was being offered a corporate position with an international company. Mr. Huang, I'm flattered, but I don't have any business experience. I've been working as a cook for the past 5 years, and before that, I studied international relations at Northwestern, but I never got to use my degree. Brian smiled. Perfect. You have the educational foundation, the linguistic skills, and most importantly, the cultural sensitivity that this position requires. Experience can be taught, but authenticity cannot. Emily felt like she was dreaming. What would this position involve exactly? Initially, you would work with our Chicago office to help establish relationships with American companies interested in Chinese partnerships. Eventually, there would be opportunities to travel to Beijing, to work directly with our headquarters staff. The starting salary would be $120,000 annually, with full benefits and performance bonuses. Emily nearly fell out of her chair. $120,000 was more than 4 times what she'd been making at the Coleman mansion. It was more money than she'd ever imagined earning. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Brian replied with a gentle smile. Miss Carter, I believe strongly in karma. The idea that good actions create good outcomes. What you did for me the other night was an act of pure kindness and cultural pride. Now I would like to return that kindness by offering you an opportunity to use your gifts in a way that honors both your heritage and your talents. Emily thought about her parents, about the dreams they'd had for her future. They'd wanted her to be proud of who she was, to use her cultural heritage as a bridge rather than a barrier. This job would allow her to do exactly that. There is one condition, Brian continued. This position would require you to embrace your Chinese identity fully. No more hiding. No more pretending to be something you're not. You would be representing Chinese culture to American business people, and that requires authenticity and pride. Emily felt tears pricking at her eyes. For the first time in years, someone was asking her to be more Chinese, not less. Mr. Huang, she said slowly, 3 days ago, I was fired from my job for supposedly being untrustworthy. Today, you're offering me a career that celebrates exactly who I am. It feels too good to be true. The best opportunities often do, Brian replied. But I assure you, this offer is completely genuine. I saw something in you the other night that reminded me of my own daughter. Intelligence, courage, and a deep connection to our culture that has been suppressed but not destroyed. I would be honored to help you reclaim that connection. Emily thought about the documents spread across her aunt's kitchen table, about the truth she'd learned about her parents' deaths. This job would give her resources she'd never had before. Money, connections, access to information. It would also give her something even more valuable, the power to no longer be invisible. When would I start? She asked. Brian's smile was radiant. How does Monday sound? Emily laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Monday sounds perfect. As they shook hands across the mahogany table, Emily realized that Angela Coleman had been right about one thing. Last night had changed everything, but not in the way Angela had feared. Instead of destroying Emily's life, that evening had given her the key to reclaiming it. Now, with resources and position she'd never dreamed of having, Emily could finally begin the work her parents had died trying to complete. Richard Coleman had no idea that the woman he'd unknowingly employed for 5 years was about to become someone with the power to bring his entire world crashing down. 2 months had transformed Emily's life beyond recognition. Her new office on the 32nd floor of the Willis Tower offered a panoramic view of Chicago that stretched all the way to Lake Michigan, a constant reminder of how far she'd risen from her aunt's cramped kitchen. The mahogany desk that dominated her workspace held multiple computer monitors, international phones, and stacks of contracts that represented millions of dollars in cross-Pacific business deals. But despite her professional success, Emily's real work happened after hours. She'd used her first paycheck to hire Marcus Thompson, a former FBI agent turned private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. Her second paycheck had gone to retaining the services of Jennifer Walsh, a forensic accountant who could trace money through the most complex international networks. With her third paycheck, she'd begun building a war chest for what she knew would be a long and expensive battle for justice. Tonight, Emily sat in her Lincoln Park apartment, a spacious 2-bedroom that she'd furnished with understated elegance, surrounded by the fruits of 2 months of intensive investigation. The coffee table in her living room looked like the headquarters of a criminal investigation unit, covered with financial records, surveillance photos, legal documents, and a detailed timeline that stretched back 15 years. Marcus knocked on her door at exactly 8 p.m., his punctuality one of the many things Emily appreciated about the grizzled former agent. At 62, he had the weathered face of someone who'd seen humanity's worst impulses. But his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the Bureau's top financial crimes investigators before his retirement. "Evening, Emily," Marcus said, settling his bulky frame into her leather armchair and opening a thick manila folder. "Got some interesting developments for you tonight." Jennifer arrived 15 minutes later, her arms full of laptop cases and portable printers. At 35, she was a rising star in the forensic accounting world, known for her ability to find hidden assets and trace money through the most sophisticated laundering schemes. Emily had hired her specifically because of her reputation for being absolutely ruthless when pursuing financial criminals. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emily said once they were all seated around her coffee table, "what do we have?" Marcus pulled out a series of surveillance photographs showing Richard Coleman entering and exiting various buildings around Chicago. "Your boy's been busy, 3 meetings this week with known associates of the Tanaka organization. That's the Japanese crime syndicate that's been expanding into the Midwest." Emily studied the photos, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and satisfaction. Every piece of evidence they gathered brought her closer to understanding the full scope of Richard's criminal enterprise. "The interesting thing," Marcus continued, "is that these meetings are happening at weird times and places. Middle of the afternoon at a coffee shop in Evanston, 7 a.m. at a parking garage downtown. These aren't normal business meetings. This is someone trying very hard not to be noticed." Jennifer opened her laptop and pulled up a complex spreadsheet that made Emily's head spin. "The financial picture is even more damning. I've been tracking the money flows from Coleman Industries for the past 18 months, and there's a clear pattern of cash being moved through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, then routed back through Hong Kong before ending up in accounts controlled by known money laundering operations." "How much money are we talking about?" Emily asked. "Conservative estimate, 200 million over the past 5 years. But here's the really interesting part." Jennifer clicked to another screen. "The pattern accelerated dramatically right after your parents' deaths, almost like Coleman suddenly had access to a much larger source of funds." Emily felt her stomach clench. The timeline matched perfectly with what her father's notes had suggested, that her parents had been killed just as they were about to expose a major expansion of the money laundering operation. "There's more," Marcus said grimly. "I've been looking into the circumstances around your parents' accident, and let me tell you, it stinks to high heaven. The police report is full of inconsistencies. The investigation was closed way too quickly, and the detective who handled the case retired to Florida 6 months later with a pension that was about twice what it should have been." Emily's hands clenched into fists. Every new piece of evidence confirmed what she'd suspected, that her parents' deaths had been covered up by corruption that reached into the Chicago Police Department itself. "Can we prove it?" she asked quietly. "Prove that Richard Coleman ordered your parents' murder. That's going to be tough," Marcus admitted. "Most of the physical evidence is long gone, and the people involved have had 10 years to perfect their stories. But proving financial crimes, that's a different story." Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. "The money trail is extensive and well documented. If we can get federal prosecutors interested, they could probably build a RICO case that would put Coleman away for 20 years minimum." Emily felt a surge of grim satisfaction. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, was designed to take down entire criminal enterprises. If federal prosecutors could prove that Coleman Industries was essentially a front for money laundering, they could seize everything Richard owned and send him to federal prison for the rest of his life. "What's our next step?" Emily asked. Marcus and Jennifer exchanged glances. "That depends," Marcus said carefully, "on how patient you're willing to be and how much risk you're willing to take." "What do you mean?" "The safe route is to package everything we've found and present it to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit," Jennifer explained. "Let them take over the investigation and hopefully build a case. It's slow, but it's legitimate. And the risky route," Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "The risky route is that we try to get Coleman to incriminate himself, set up a situation where he thinks he's dealing with new criminal partners. Get him talking about the old days. Maybe catch him admitting to things that would be admissible in court." Emily felt her pulse quicken. The idea of confronting Richard directly, of looking him in the eye while he unknowingly confessed to murdering her parents, was both terrifying and appealing. "How would that work?" "Your position at Huang International gives you access to exactly the kind of international business connections that someone like Coleman would want to exploit," Marcus explained. "We could set up a fake business proposition. Say, a Chinese company looking for an American partner to help move money through legitimate-looking real estate investments. Coleman's greedy enough and desperate enough that he'd probably jump at the opportunity." Emily considered the plan. It was dangerous, If Richard suspected anything, he could disappear with his money, or worse, decide that Emily knew too much and needed to be silenced permanently. But it was also the most direct path to getting the evidence they needed. "There's another factor to consider," Jennifer added quietly. "Coleman's financial situation is getting worse. My sources tell me he's missed payments to some very dangerous people. He's under increasing pressure, which makes him more likely to take risks, but also more dangerous to approach." Emily thought about Angela Coleman. Probably still living in that mansion, still playing the role of the wealthy society wife while her husband's criminal empire crumbled around her. Did Angela know what Richard had done? Was she complicit in the money laundering, or was she just another victim of his lies? "I need to think about this," Emily said finally. "It's a big decision." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Smart. This isn't something to rush into. But Emily, I want you to know, in 30 years of investigating financial crimes, I've rarely seen evidence this solid or a case this righteous. Your parents died trying to expose these people. If we can finish what they started, we'll be serving justice in the purest sense." After Marcus and Jennifer left, Emily stood at her living room window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there, Richard Coleman was going about his life, probably believing he'd gotten away with murder. He had no idea that the young woman he'd unknowingly employed for 5 years had become someone with the resources and determination to destroy him. But Emily knew that wanting justice and achieving it were two very different things. Richard Coleman was a powerful man with dangerous connections and unlimited resources. Taking him down would require careful planning, perfect execution, and more courage than she'd ever had to summon. She picked up her phone and scrolled to Brian Huang's number. As her mentor and employer, he deserved to know that his director of cultural relations was planning to take on one of Chicago's most dangerous criminals. More than that, she might need his help to make it work. Tomorrow, Emily decided, she would begin planning the most important business meeting of her life. Emily's revelation to Brian Huang had gone better than she'd dared hope. The distinguished businessman had listened to her story with growing outrage, his usually composed demeanor cracking as she described her parents' murder and Richard Coleman's role in their deaths. When she finished, Brian had been silent for a long moment before speaking 4 words that changed everything. "We will destroy him." Now, 3 weeks later, Emily sat in a conference room at Huang International, surrounded by the most sophisticated intelligence operation she'd ever imagined. Brian had mobilized resources that went far beyond what her private investigators could access: corporate intelligence networks, international banking contacts, and connections within the Chinese government that opened doors Emily hadn't even known existed. "The beauty of our position," Brian explained to the assembled team, "is that Richard Coleman will see exactly what he wants to see: a legitimate Chinese company with deep pockets and flexible ethics. His desperation will blind him to any inconsistencies in our story." Marcus Thompson sat across from Emily, looking more energized than she'd seen him since they'd started working together. Having unlimited resources to pursue a case had rejuvenated the retired FBI agent, and he'd thrown himself into the operation with the enthusiasm of someone finally able to do the job properly. "Coleman's financial situation has gotten critical," Marcus reported, consulting his notes. "My sources tell me he's defaulted on payments to at least 3 major creditors, including some very unforgiving people in the Tanaka organization. He's desperate for an influx of cash, which makes our timing perfect." Jennifer Walsh had her laptop open, displaying a complex organizational chart that showed the web of shell companies and offshore accounts that Richard used to hide his money. "We've identified the key vulnerabilities in his financial structure. If we can get him to admit to using Coleman Industries as a front for money laundering, we'll have him on multiple federal charges." Emily studied the faces around the conference table. Brian's quiet determination, Marcus's professional intensity, Jennifer's analytical focus. These people were helping her pursue justice for her parents, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was dragging them into something dangerous. "What's our risk assessment?" she asked. Brian's expression grew serious. "Considerable. Richard Coleman is not just a criminal. He's a cornered criminal with connections to violent organizations. If he suspects we're investigating him, he could react unpredictably, which is why we need to be absolutely perfect in our execution," Marcus added. "One mistake, one inconsistency in our story, and this whole operation could blow up in our faces." The plan they'd developed was elegant in its simplicity. Brian would approach Richard through legitimate business channels, proposing a partnership between Coleman Industries and a fictional Chinese real estate development company. The company, Jade Mountain Holdings, existed on paper, complete with corporate registrations in Hong Kong and Beijing, maintained bank accounts, and a website showcasing impressive but non-existent projects. Emily's role would be crucial as Jade Mountain's cultural liaison officer. She would be present at all meetings to facilitate communication and build trust. Richard wouldn't recognize her immediately. She'd undergone a dramatic transformation from the invisible kitchen worker he'd barely noticed to a polished corporate executive with a completely different wardrobe and bearing. "The key is patience," Brian emphasized. "We can't rush this. Coleman needs to believe that we're genuine partners who share his flexible approach to financial regulations. We'll start with small transactions, build trust over several meetings, and gradually draw him into admitting more serious crimes." Emily felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. The thought of sitting across a conference table from Richard Coleman, looking him in the eye while he unknowingly confessed to murdering her parents, was both terrifying and deeply satisfying. Meanwhile, across town in the Coleman mansion, a very different kind of tension was building. Angela Coleman stood in her husband's study, staring at the stack of overdue notices and threatening letters that covered his usually pristine desk. Richard was in the shower, and she'd taken the opportunity to investigate the source of his increasingly erratic behavior over the past few weeks. What she'd found terrified her. The letters painted a picture of financial collapse that was far worse than anything Richard had admitted. Coleman Industries was hemorrhaging money. Their personal accounts were nearly empty, and the house itself was apparently collateral for loans that were now in default. But it was the handwritten note tucked between two invoices that made Angela's blood run cold. "Final warning. Payment due in 72 hours, or we take alternative measures. T.Y." Angela knew enough about Richard's business dealings to recognize the implications of that note. T.I. could only be Takeshi Yamamoto, the Tanaka organization's representative in Chicago. Alternative measures from people like that didn't involve lawyers or credit agencies. She heard the shower turn off upstairs and quickly returned the papers to their original positions. When Richard emerged from their bedroom 20 minutes later, freshly shaved and dressed in one of his expensive suits, Angela was waiting for him with coffee and the morning newspaper, playing the role of the supportive wife she'd perfected over 15 years of marriage. "Any important calls this morning?" she asked casually. Richard's phone had been buzzing constantly for the past week, but he'd become increasingly secretive about his conversations. This morning was no different. He glanced at the screen and immediately stepped into the hallway to take the call. Angela strained to hear fragments of conversation through the partially open door. She caught words that made her stomach clench. New partners, Chinese investors, and most alarmingly, cash flow solutions. When Richard returned, his demeanor had shifted completely. The tension that had been radiating from him for weeks was replaced by something that looked almost like excitement. "Good news?" Angela asked, though she wasn't sure she really wanted to know. "Potentially very good news," Richard replied, straightening his tie with more confidence than she'd seen from him in months. "There might be a solution to our temporary financial difficulties." Angela forced a smile. "That's wonderful, darling. What kind of solution?" "International partnerships, new markets, the kind of opportunities that could turn everything around very quickly." Richard's vague answers and excited energy reminded Angela of the early days of their marriage, when he'd been building Coleman Industries through deals that he'd never quite explained in detail. She'd learned not to ask too many questions back then. But the threatening letter from the Tanaka organization suggested that maybe she should have been paying closer attention all along. After Richard left for his office, Angela found herself pacing through the mansion that had been her sanctuary for 15 years. Every room held memories of the life they'd built together. But now she wondered how much of it had been constructed on foundations of crime and corruption. The irony wasn't lost on her, that 3 months ago, she'd fired Emily Carter for supposedly being untrustworthy. Now, as she contemplated the possibility that her own husband had been lying to her for their entire marriage, Angela realized that she might have destroyed an innocent woman's life to protect secrets she hadn't even known existed. She thought about Emily sometimes, wondering where the young woman had ended up after being cast out so dramatically. Angela had been so consumed with jealousy and paranoia that night that she'd convinced herself Emily was some kind of threat to her marriage. Now, facing the reality of Richard's criminal connections, she realized that the real threats to her life had been much closer to home. The mansion felt different now, less like a sanctuary, and more like a prison. Angela walked through rooms filled with expensive furniture and artwork, wondering how much of it would disappear when Richard's crimes finally caught up with him. Because despite his optimistic talk about new partnerships and solutions, Angela could read the fear in her husband's eyes. Richard Coleman was a man living on borrowed time, and Angela was beginning to suspect that she might be too. What neither Angela nor Richard knew was that Emily Carter was very much alive and thriving, and that she was about to walk back into their lives with the power to destroy everything they'd built on the graves of her parents. The web of deception that had protected Richard Coleman for 15 years was about to be torn apart by the one person he'd never bothered to notice, the invisible young woman who'd been collecting evidence against him from inside his own home. The Ritz-Carlton's private dining room overlooked Grant Park, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Lake Michigan that sparkled in the late afternoon sun. Emily stood at one of those windows, watching joggers navigate the lakefront path below, while her heart hammered against her ribs. In 30 minutes, she would come face to face with Richard Coleman for the first time since that terrible morning when Angela had destroyed her life. But today, she wasn't Emily Carter, the invisible kitchen worker who could be dismissed and discarded. Today, she was Emily Chen, Cultural Liaison Officer for Jade Mountain Holdings. Wearing a tailored Armani suit that cost more than she used to make in 3 months, her hair was professionally styled in a sleek bob, her makeup was flawless, and the confidence she projected had been carefully cultivated over months of preparation. "Remember," Brian Huang said quietly, adjusting his platinum cufflinks as he reviewed their strategy one final time. "Coleman will be desperate. Desperate men make mistakes, but they're also dangerous. If at any point you feel unsafe or overwhelmed, we abort the operation immediately." Emily nodded, though they both knew that backing down now wasn't really an option. Too much had been invested in this moment. Not just money and time, but hope for justice that had been deferred for 15 years. Marcus Thompson entered the dining room, his usually rumpled appearance transformed by an expensive suit that made him look like a high-end security consultant rather than a retired FBI agent. He carried a briefcase containing recording equipment so sophisticated that it could capture clear audio from across the room, while remaining completely undetectable. "Coleman just arrived downstairs," Marcus reported. "He's with his lawyer and what looks like an accountant. Interesting that he brought backup. Suggests he's taking this meeting very seriously." Emily felt a spike of adrenaline. This was really happening, after months of planning and investigation. She was about to sit across a table from the man who had ordered her parents' murder. The door opened, and Emily's first glimpse of Richard Coleman in 4 months was shocking. The confident businessman who had commanded attention at dinner parties now looked haggard and desperate. His expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and overwhelming stress. "Mr. Huang," Richard said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice as he crossed the room with his hand extended. "Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice. These are exciting times for international partnerships." Brian shook Richard's hand with precisely calibrated warmth, friendly enough to suggest genuine interest, reserved enough to maintain the image of a careful businessman. "Mr. Coleman, the pleasure is mine. I believe you know the opportunities that exist for the right kind of cooperation between our organizations." Richard's eyes swept the room, taking inventory of the players present. When his gaze landed on Emily, she saw a flicker of something that might have been recognition, but it passed so quickly that she couldn't be sure. "I'd like you to meet our cultural liaison officer, Emily Chen," Brian said smoothly. "She's been instrumental in helping us navigate American business practices." Emily stepped forward with a professional smile, extending her hand to the man who had destroyed her family. "Mr. Coleman, it's a pleasure to meet you." Richard's handshake was firm but distracted, his attention already moving on to the other participants in the meeting. Emily realized with a mixture of relief and disappointment that he truly didn't recognize her. 5 years of serving his meals and cleaning his home, and she had been so invisible to him that even dramatic physical changes couldn't trigger his memory. The meeting that followed was a masterpiece of carefully orchestrated deception. Brian presented Jade Mountain Holdings as a legitimate real estate development company looking for American partners to help navigate complex international investment regulations. Richard, meanwhile, positioned Coleman Industries as exactly the kind of flexible organization that could facilitate creative financial solutions. The beauty of working with established American companies, Richard explained as they reviewed fabricated development proposals, is that we understand how to structure transactions that benefit all parties while maintaining appropriate discretion. Emily took notes throughout the conversation. Her pen moving steadily across legal pads while recording devices captured every word. To anyone watching, she appeared to be a diligent employee documenting business discussions. In reality, she was collecting evidence that would destroy the man sitting across from her. Discretion is indeed valuable, Brian agreed. Our investors prefer arrangements that minimize regulatory complications. Richard's eyes lit up with an excitement that was almost predatory. Mr. Huang, I think you'll find that Coleman Industries has extensive experience in structuring international investments that remain invisible to unnecessary oversight. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Richard was walking directly into their trap, his desperation making him reckless in ways that would have been unthinkable during his more prosperous days. As the meeting progressed, Richard became increasingly comfortable with what he perceived as kindred spirits. He began sharing details about shell companies, offshore accounts, and creative accounting practices that painted a clear picture of an extensive money laundering operation. The key, Richard explained, leaning forward conspiratorially, is understanding that American banking regulations are designed by people who think small when you're moving serious money, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. You need partners who understand that traditional rules become more like guidelines. Brian nodded approvingly. In our experience, the most profitable partnerships are those where all parties understand the importance of flexibility. Richard's lawyer, a nervous-looking man in his 50s, kept shooting warning glances at his client, but Richard was too energized by the prospect of solving his financial crisis to pay attention to caution. I can show you transaction histories that would make your head spin, Richard continued. Real estate deals that exist only on paper. Investment funds that move money faster than any government agency can track. The profit margins are extraordinary when you're not limited by conventional thinking. Emily forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. While internally rejoicing, Richard was confessing to federal crimes in language so clear that even the most conservative prosecutor would be able to build a case. But as the meeting continued, Emily noticed something troubling. Richard's phone kept buzzing with messages that made his expression increasingly tense. Each interruption chipped away at his forced enthusiasm, replacing it with the haunted look of a man running out of time. Gentlemen, Richard said finally, glancing at his watch, I hope you'll forgive me, but I have some urgent matters that require my immediate attention. However, I'm very interested in moving forward with this partnership quickly. How quickly? Brian asked. Ideally, we could have initial funding in place within the week. I have some pressing obligations that would benefit from immediate cash flow. The desperation in Richard's voice was unmistakable now. Emily realized that whatever pressure he was facing from his criminal associates had reached a critical point. As the meeting concluded and hands were shaken, Emily felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease. They'd gathered more incriminating evidence than they'd dared hope for. But Richard's obvious desperation suggested that events were accelerating beyond their carefully planned timeline. After Richard and his associates left, Brian, Marcus, and Emily remained in the dining room to debrief. That went better than I expected, Marcus said, already reviewing the audio recordings on his tablet. We've got him on money laundering, conspiracy, and probably RICO violations. This is enough to put him away for decades. Maybe too well, Emily said quietly. Did you see how desperate he looked? He's under serious pressure from someone, and that makes him unpredictable. Brian nodded grimly. We need to move quickly now. If Coleman is as cornered as he appears, he might do something reckless that could endanger all of us. Emily stared out at Lake Michigan, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. After months of careful planning, they were finally close to achieving justice for her parents, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous part of their operation was still ahead of them. Richard Coleman was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him more dangerous than ever. The Coleman mansion looked exactly as Emily remembered it, imposing, elegant, and completely unaware that its foundations were about to crumble. She sat in the passenger seat of Brian Huang's black Mercedes, watching the familiar circular driveway through tinted windows while her heart hammered against her ribs. After 4 months of careful planning, the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. "Are you ready for this?" Brian asked quietly, his hand resting on the briefcase that contained enough evidence to destroy Richard Coleman's life. Emily adjusted the wire hidden beneath her tailored blazer and checked her watch. 3 o'clock, exactly as scheduled. Behind them, Marcus Thompson sat in an unmarked van half a block away, monitoring their audio feed and coordinating with the FBI agents who were positioned throughout the neighborhood. "I've been ready for this my entire life," Emily replied, and realized it was true. Every moment since her parents' death had been leading to this confrontation. They were accompanied by 2 men who appeared to be Brian's business associates, but were actually federal agents specializing in financial crimes. Agent David Park looked young enough to be a recent MBA graduate, while Agent Martinez had the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent decades dealing with white-collar criminals. The front door opened before they could ring the bell, revealing Richard Coleman in what was clearly his most expensive suit. But no amount of Italian tailoring could hide the desperation that radiated from his every gesture. His smile was too bright, his handshake too firm, his enthusiasm too forced. "Mr. Huang, welcome to my home," Richard said, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of a man trying to sell his soul. "I hope you'll find our meeting today productive." Emily followed Brian into the mansion's marble foyer, fighting waves of memory and emotion. The last time she'd walked through these doors, she'd been carrying a suitcase and Angela's threats ringing in her ears. Now she was returning as someone with the power to bring this entire world crashing down. "Your home is magnificent," Brian replied diplomatically. "I can see why Chicago's business community holds you in such high regard." Richard's laugh was hollow. "Well, success requires taking calculated risks. I believe that's something we have in common." They were led to Richard's study, the same room where Emily had overheard countless phone conversations that had seemed merely mysterious at the time, but now took on sinister significance. The mahogany desk that dominated the space was covered with documents that Richard quickly shuffled into neat piles. "Please, gentlemen, make yourselves comfortable," Richard said, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged around a coffee table. "Can I offer you anything? Coffee? Whiskey? Something stronger?" Emily noticed that Richard's hands trembled slightly as he poured himself a drink despite the early hour. The man was barely holding himself together. "Mr. Coleman," Brian began once they were seated, "my associates and I have reviewed your proposal regarding the Jade Mountain Partnership, and we're prepared to move forward with the initial funding transfer." Richard's relief was palpable. "Excellent. The sooner we can establish the financial framework, the sooner we can begin realizing profits for all parties involved." Agent Park, playing his role as a financial consultant, opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of documents. "We'll need detailed information about your offshore accounting structures and shell company networks. Our investors require complete transparency regarding fund movement and profit distribution." Emily watched Richard's face carefully as he began describing his money laundering operation in detail. His desperation made him reckless, and he provided information that would have taken federal investigators months to uncover through traditional means. "The beauty of the system we've developed," Richard explained, spreading financial charts across the coffee table, "is that money can move through 6 different jurisdictions and 3 shell companies before anyone can trace its origins. We've processed over $200 million this way without a single regulatory flag." Emily forced herself to maintain a neutral expression while internally celebrating. Richard was confessing to federal crimes with the casual confidence of a man who believed he was among friends. "Impressive," Brian said approvingly. "Our Beijing investors will be particularly interested in your Asian connections. I understand you have relationships with certain entrepreneurial organizations in that region." Richard's smile took on a predatory quality. "Let's just say that when you're moving serious money, traditional banking relationships can be limiting. We've found that more flexible partners often provide better service." Agent Martinez leaned forward. "Could you be more specific about these partnerships? Our investors prefer to understand exactly who they'll be working with." Emily held her breath as Richard walked directly into their trap. "Well, since we're all friends here," Richard said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "we've had a very productive relationship with the Tanaka organization for over 15 years. They handle certain aspects of fund movement that legitimate banks won't touch. Emily felt her pulse racing. Richard had just admitted to working with a known criminal organization, exactly the kind of RICO predicate that federal prosecutors needed to seize everything he owned. But Richard wasn't finished. The whiskey and his desperate relief at finally finding a solution to his financial crisis were making him increasingly reckless. The only complication we've had, Richard continued, was about 10 years ago when we had some employee issues. A couple of our restaurant partners got cold feet about their participation in the operation. They threatened to go to the authorities. Emily's blood turned to ice. He was about to confess to her parents' murder. What happened? Agent Park asked quietly. Richard shrugged with casual indifference. We handled it. Sometimes business requires difficult decisions. But once word got out about the consequences of disloyalty, we haven't had any similar problems. Emily felt the room spinning around her. He'd just admitted to murdering her parents with the same tone he might use to discuss firing an incompetent employee. Brian's voice was carefully neutral when he spoke. That's quite a comprehensive approach to business management. Well, you can't let employees think they have leverage over you, Richard replied. James and Lily Chen thought they could threaten our entire operation. They had to be reminded that there are consequences for that kind of betrayal. Emily shot to her feet, no longer able to maintain her composure. You murdered them, she said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. You killed James and Lily Chen because they tried to do the right thing. Richard stared at her in confusion, clearly trying to process how his potential business partner knew the names of two people who died a decade ago. I'm sorry, who are you exactly? Richard asked. But Emily could see recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes. Emily pulled off the wire hidden beneath her blazer and threw it on the coffee table. I'm Emily Chen Carter. James and Lily Chen were my parents, and you just confessed to murdering them. The color drained from Richard's face as the pieces clicked into place. You're the kitchen girl, but how did I become someone with the power to destroy you? Emily finished. It's amazing what people can accomplish when they're not being kept invisible in your kitchen. Agent Martinez was already on his feet, badge and handcuffs in hand. Richard Coleman. You're under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, and solicitation of murder. The front door burst open as FBI agents flooded the mansion. Richard looked around wildly, finally understanding that he'd walked into an elaborate trap. This is impossible, he stammered. You can't be. She was just a cook. She was nobody. That was your mistake, Emily said coldly. You never bothered to notice that the nobody in your kitchen was collecting evidence against you for 5 years. As Agent Martinez read Richard his rights, Emily heard footsteps on the marble staircase. Angela Coleman appeared at the top of the stairs, her face a mask of shock and growing understanding. Richard, Angela called down, her voice small and frightened. What's happening? Emily looked up at the woman who had destroyed her life 4 months ago and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but pity. Angela was about to learn that the life she'd fought so hard to protect had been built on blood and lies. Mrs. Coleman? Agent Park called up to her. We're going to need to speak with you as well. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, Emily felt a profound sense of completion. Justice for her parents was finally within reach. But she also felt something else. A recognition that destroying Richard Coleman, while necessary, couldn't bring back the people she'd lost, or erase the pain of growing up without them. The mansion that had once seemed so powerful and imposing now felt hollow and temporary. Soon it would be seized by federal marshals, its contents auctioned off to pay Richard's debts. The Coleman dynasty was ending, not with glory, but with the same brutal efficiency that had built it. Emily stood in the marble foyer where she'd first been accused of theft and betrayal, now vindicated but forever changed by the journey that had brought her back to this place. 6 months after Richard Coleman's arrest, Emily stood in the federal courthouse watching the final chapter of a story that had consumed 15 years of her life. The man who had murdered her parents sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his once commanding presence reduced to the hunched posture of someone who had lost everything that mattered to him. The defendant will rise for sentencing, Judge Patricia Morrison announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Richard Coleman struggled to his feet, his court-appointed attorney beside him. The expensive suits and confident demeanor were gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed appearance of a man who had watched his empire crumble in spectacular fashion. Emily sat in the gallery between Brian Huang and her Aunt Remedios. Feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion, the federal prosecution had been swift and merciless, with Richard's recorded confession serving as the centerpiece of a RICO case that had dismantled his entire criminal organization. "Mr. Coleman," Judge Morrison continued, "you have been found guilty of conspiracy, money laundering, solicitation of murder, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. These crimes have caused immeasurable harm to countless victims over more than a decade." Emily thought about Angela Coleman, who had avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully with federal investigators. Angela's testimony had revealed the extent to which she'd been kept ignorant of her husband's criminal activities, but it had also exposed her willingness to destroy innocent people to protect her lifestyle. She'd surrendered the mansion, the artwork, the jewelry, everything tied to Richard's crimes, and disappeared into a modest apartment somewhere in the suburbs. "The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole," Judge Morrison announced. "Additionally, all assets tied to your criminal enterprise are hereby forfeited to the United States government." Richard's shoulders sagged as the words hit him. 25 years meant he would likely die in prison. His legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about greed and violence. Emily felt Aunt Remedios squeeze her hand. Her aunt had aged visibly during the stress of the trial, but her eyes held a fierce satisfaction that reminded Emily of her mother's determination. "Your parents can rest in peace now," Remedios whispered in Mandarin. "Justice has finally found its way home." As court adjourned, and Richard was led away in shackles, Emily remained seated for a moment, processing the finality of it all. The man who had shaped her life through violence and loss was gone. Reduced to a number in the federal prison system, Brian Huang placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. Emily considered the question seriously. "Complete," she said finally. "Like, I can finally stop looking over my shoulder and start looking forward." The weeks that followed brought a series of revelations that continued to reshape Emily's understanding of her parents' legacy. Federal investigators, following leads from Richard's case, had uncovered a vast network of corruption that reached into Chicago's police department, city government, and business community. Detective Murphy, the man who had closed her parents' case so quickly, was arrested for accepting bribes to cover up crimes committed by Richard's associates. 3 city officials were indicted for facilitating money laundering through fraudulent real estate deals. The Tanaka organization's Chicago operations were dismantled completely, with dozens of arrests following Richard's cooperation with federal authorities. Emily's role in exposing the conspiracy had made her something of a celebrity in Chicago's Asian American community. She'd been invited to speak at community centers and universities about justice, perseverance, and the importance of honoring one's cultural heritage, but the recognition that meant the most to her came from an unexpected source. The letter arrived at her office on a Tuesday morning, forwarded through several lawyers and bearing the return address of the federal prison, where Richard Coleman was serving his sentence. Emily stared at it for several minutes before finding the courage to open it. "Dear Miss Chen, I know I have no right to write to you, and I understand if you choose not to read this letter, but I needed to try to express something that has been weighing on my conscience. I want you to know that not a day passes in this place without me thinking about what I did to your family. Your parents were good people who tried to do the right thing, and I destroyed them for it. No amount of punishment I receive will ever balance that scale. What haunts me most is not just that I took their lives, but that I robbed them of the chance to see what an extraordinary woman their daughter became. Your strength, your intelligence, your refusal to be broken by what I did to you. These are testaments to the kind of people they were. I don't ask for forgiveness because I know that's not mine to request, but I wanted you to know that their deaths meant something. The investigation you initiated has brought down an entire network of criminals who would still be victimizing innocent people if not for your courage. Your parents raised a daughter who made their sacrifice count for something. I hope that brings you some measure of peace. Richard Coleman." Emily read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in her desk drawer. She wasn't sure she believed Richard's remorse was genuine. Prison had a way of making people philosophical about their crimes, but the acknowledgement felt important somehow. That evening, Emily stood in her apartment preparing for a dinner that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Brian Huang was coming over, not as her employer or co-conspirator, but as something that might become much more personal. Their relationship had evolved slowly during the months of working together, built on mutual respect and shared values that went deeper than business partnerships. She was arranging flowers in a crystal vase when her doorbell rang. Brian stood in the hallway holding a bottle of wine and wearing a smile that made Emily's heart flutter in ways that had nothing to do with criminal investigations or corporate partnerships. "Good evening, Emily," he said, and the way he spoke her name carried warmth that felt like coming home. Over dinner, they talked about everything except the case that had brought them together. Brian told her about his daughter in Beijing, who was studying international law and wanted to follow in Emily's footsteps. Emily shared stories about her childhood, about the dreams her parents had held for her future. "They would be so proud of you," Brian said, as they sat on her balcony overlooking the lake. "Not just for what you accomplished, but for who you've become." Emily thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the invisible kitchen worker who hid her heritage, to the confident executive who had brought down a criminal empire. She'd learned to be proud of her Chinese identity, to see it as a source of strength rather than something to hide. "I think they would be proud of all of us," Emily replied. "We didn't just get justice for them. We prevented other families from suffering the same loss." As the evening wound down and Brian prepared to leave, he paused at Emily's door. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. "Huang International is opening a new office in Beijing next year. We need someone to head our North American Cultural Relations Division." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me a promotion or asking me to move to China?" "Both," Brian admitted. "It would mean spending part of each year in Beijing, working directly with my headquarters staff. You'd be building bridges between cultures on a scale that could impact thousands of business relationships." Emily considered the offer. A year ago, the idea of moving to China would have terrified her. Now, it felt like an opportunity to complete a circle her parents had started when they left Guangzhou with dreams of building something better for their daughter. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. But Emily," Brian's voice carried a note of vulnerability she'd never heard before. "I hope you'll consider that Beijing wouldn't just be offering you a career opportunity, it might be offering you something more personal as well." After he left, Emily stood on her balcony looking out at Lake Michigan and thinking about the future. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear music drifting from Chinatown, traditional Chinese instruments playing melodies that her mother had hummed while cooking dinner all those years ago. The song that had changed everything in the Coleman mansion had been more than just a display of cultural pride. It had been the echo of her ancestors' wisdom, guiding her back to herself and forward toward a future that honored both where she'd come from and where she was going. Emily closed her eyes and began to hum the same melody her mother had taught her, letting the ancient tune carry her voice out over the water toward whatever came next. Her parents' sacrifice had not been in vain. Justice had been served. Truth had prevailed. And their daughter was finally free to become everything they'd dreamed she could be.